The suit was what she noticed first, not the gun at his hip, not the 3 men flanking him in the doorway, not the way the hallway light carved shadows into his face that made him look less like a person and more like a warning. It was the suit. Charcoal wool, perfectly pressed, not a single wrinkle. She had scheduled his fitting for that suit 4 months ago. She had confirmed the appointment twice. She had taken the call from the tailor herself when Voss wanted to reschedule and smoothed the whole thing over, without anyone knowing there had been a problem at all. She was very good at that, smoothing things over, making problems disappear before they became visible. She just hadn't managed to do it with herself. Tatum Reeve stood in the doorway of her apartment on the 4th floor of a building that smelled like mildew and fried onions, and whatever her neighbor cooked on Thursday nights that always made the hallway unbearable, and she stared at Everett Voss like he had appeared out of a hole in the floor. He stared back. Neither of them said anything for a long moment. Then he looked past her shoulder into the apartment, and something crossed his face that she couldn't name. Not disgust, not pity, something quieter than both of those things. "You need to cancel my 9 o'clock tomorrow," he said. Tatum blinked. "I'm sorry." "The meeting with Hargrove." "Cancel it." He still hadn't looked at her directly. He was looking at the wall behind her, at the water stain shaped like a boot print near the ceiling, at the single lamp she'd left on that wasn't bright enough to do much of anything. "Push it to Thursday." "I can do that," she said carefully. "From my phone. You didn't need to come here." "No," he agreed. "I didn't." He still didn't leave. She'd worked for Everett Voss for 2 years, 3 months, and 11 days. She knew his schedule the way other people knew their own heartbeat. Automatically, without having to think about it, just there when she needed it. She knew he took his coffee black and that he didn't actually drink most of it, that he used the cup as something to do with his hands in meetings. She knew he had a scar along his left jaw that he'd stopped explaining to people somewhere around the time she started working for him. She knew that he ran the most carefully constructed criminal organization on the Eastern Seaboard, not by being the most violent man in the room, but by being the most patient one. And that patience, she had learned, was more frightening than violence by a considerable margin. What she did not know was why he was standing in her hallway at 9:47 on a Tuesday night, looking at her water stain like it had personally wronged him. "Voss," she said, because she always called him Voss, had called him Voss from the first week when she realized that Mr. Voss felt too formal and his first name felt too dangerous. "Is there something else?" He finally looked at her, not at the wall, at her. She watched his eyes move, quick, efficient, the same way he processed everything, down to the hand she was holding against her side, where she'd pressed her palm flat against the hem of her shirt. The shirt that was not, she realized with a dull sort of clarity, doing a very good job of hiding the fact that it was wet. "Sit down," he said. "I'm fine." Tatum. He never called her Tatum. In 2 years and 3 months and 11 days, she could count on one hand the number of times he had used her first name, and each time it had been because something was wrong enough that he'd dropped the professional distance like a coat he didn't need anymore. She sat down, not because he told her to, because her legs had apparently made that decision while she was busy arguing with him, and she found herself on the edge of the couch with her hand still pressed flat against her ribs and Voss crouching in front of her, his suit jacket still perfectly pressed, looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before in her life. She'd seen him at contract negotiations where the other party had a gun under the table. She'd seen him deliver news to men that ended careers, lives, futures. Deliver it the same way he'd order lunch, clean and efficient and without flourish. She'd seen him in rooms where the temperature dropped 10 degrees the moment he walked in, because every person present understood exactly what his presence meant. She had never seen him look the way he looked right now, like he was doing math and not liking the answer. "Let me see," he said. "It's not a big deal. Let me see." She moved her hand. The cut was along her left side, low on the rib cage, 3 inches long, and not deep enough to be life-threatening, but deep enough that it had been bleeding steadily for 40 minutes, and she'd already gone through half a roll of paper towels trying to manage it. She'd been working her way up to doing something about it. She had a first aid kit in the bathroom cabinet. She'd had a plan. The plan had been interrupted by Voss appearing in her doorway like something out of a threat she'd forgotten to file. He looked at the cut for a long moment without speaking. "Kitchen," he finally said. "Do you have anything?" "First aid kit. Bathroom. Under the sink." He was gone before she finished the sentence. She heard him moving through the apartment, heard the cabinet open, heard him pause, probably at the state of the bathroom, which was small and old and had a shower head that only worked properly if you held it at a 45-degree angle and pleaded with it. And then he came back with the kit and a clean towel and crouched in front of her again, like it was the most natural thing in the world for Everett Voss to be doing at 9:47 on a Tuesday. "This happened tonight," he said. "An hour ago. How?" She hesitated. He glanced up at her and she understood without him saying anything that he already knew she was deciding how much to tell him, and that he was going to wait her out, because that was what he did. He was extraordinarily patient for a man who ran his life like a ledger. "There's a man in 3B, she said. "He has a problem with me." "What kind of problem?" "The kind where he decided his keys were more important than my continued existence in this building." Voss went very still. She had seen him go still like that before. It was not the stillness of someone who had stopped paying attention. It was the opposite. It was a man organizing information behind his eyes, sorting it into columns, weighing it against other information she couldn't see. "He cut you," Voss said. It was not a question. "He cornered me in the stairwell. He has a problem with—" She stopped. "He has a lot of problems. I'm just the most convenient one tonight. Did you call the police?" "Voss." He looked up again. "We both know why I didn't call the police," she said quietly. "Because calling the police from this building, with her name and her address and her proximity to the man she worked for, would create a paper trail that led straight to his front door. She had understood that from her first day. She had filed it away the same way she filed everything, quietly, without drama, tucked into the part of herself that kept track of what was safe and what was not. He held her gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he looked back down at the cut and started cleaning it with a focus and efficiency that suggested he'd done this before, possibly often. "You should have called me," he said. "You're getting married in 6 weeks. That has nothing to do with this. It has everything to do with this." She kept her voice even. She was good at keeping her voice even. "You're going to marry Cressida Langham in 6 weeks, and then you'll have a wife who will want to know where you go and why, and I'll need to be a problem you don't have. I was managing it. You were bleeding on your couch. I was getting to the managing part." He didn't respond to that. He worked in silence, cleaning and closing the cut with the strips from the kit, his hands steady in a way that she found oddly steadying in return, which made no sense, and she made a mental note to examine that later when he wasn't in her apartment. The apartment, she was acutely aware, was small. It was very, very small. It was a studio and a half, the half being a sleeping alcove with a curtain instead of a door, and it sat on the 4th floor of a building that had been respectable once, maybe 30 years ago, before the neighborhood shifted and the management company stopped caring and the hallway started smelling the way it did. She had chosen it because it was what she could afford, and because it was 2 bus stops from the office, and because the super didn't ask questions, and she had, at that point in her life, needed a place where nobody asked questions. She had not chosen it to be the kind of apartment that Everett Voss walked through. She watched him become aware of the apartment the way she always watched him become aware of things. Not all at once, but in pieces, cataloguing. The curtain instead of a door. The folding table she used as a desk, covered in the printouts she'd been working through that morning because the office printer had been down. The lamp that wasn't bright enough. The window that looked onto the brick wall of the building next door. "How long have you lived here?" he said. 2 years. The whole time you've worked for me." "Yes." Something moved across his face again. That same expression she couldn't name. "Your salary," he started. "Is fine," she said, I send money home." He stopped. She hadn't meant to say that. It was the kind of information she kept in the same column as everything else. Sorted, filed, not for external consumption. She didn't talk about home. She didn't talk about the reason she'd come to this city with 2 bags and a contact number for a temp agency, and spent 8 months doing administrative work for people who looked through her before she'd landed on Voss's desk, through a chain of referrals she'd never fully traced. She didn't talk about any of it, but it was 9:47 on a Tuesday, and she had a cut along her ribs and he was in her apartment in his charcoal suit, and apparently her internal filing system had developed a leak. "Home," he repeated. "My mother, younger sister." She looked at the wall. "It's fine. It covers what it needs to cover." He was quiet for a long time. She became aware suddenly of how tired she was, not the kind of tired that sleep fixed. The other kind, the kind that had accumulated over months and years of doing everything correctly and efficiently, and without complaint, and coming home to a studio apartment, with a curtain for a door and a window that looked at brick, and getting up the next morning and doing it again. She was 28 years old and she was very, very tired. "The man in 3B, Voss said. "He's done this before." It wasn't a question. He had looked at her the way he looked at documents when he'd already figured out the conclusion before he reached the last page. "He has a pattern," she admitted. "With you specifically. With whoever he decides has disrespected him. Currently that's me." "Why?" She almost laughed. "Because I make more money than him. Because I come and go at odd hours. Because last month I told his girlfriend the building management's number when she knocked on my door at 2 in the morning and needed help, and he found out." She paused. "He's the kind of man who finds that kind of thing insulting." Voss sat back on his heels and looked at her. She recognized the look. It was the look he gave to problems that he had finished analyzing and was now deciding what to do with. She'd seen it directed at financial irregularities and security failures, and men who thought they could skim from the accounts he trusted them to manage. She had never had it directed at her before. "I want you out of this building," he said. "Voss, by the end of the week. I can't afford, I'll cover it." "Absolutely not." The words came out faster than she intended. Cleaner. She straightened up, ignoring the pull of the bandage along her ribs. "I don't take money like that. I've never taken money like that, and I'm not starting now. Not from you." He looked at her for a moment. "Like what? Like a problem being managed. That's not what I said. That's what it is." She held his gaze steadily because that was the only way to have any kind of conversation with Everett Voss. "Look away and you'd already lost. I know how this works. I've watched you work for 2 years. You identify a liability, you neutralize it cleanly, you move on. I am not a liability for you to neutralize. I am your administrative director, and I am managing my own situation, and I would appreciate it if you would let me do that." Another long silence. She expected him to argue. He was, when he chose to be, very good at arguing, not loudly, never loudly, but precisely, surgical, finding the exact point where the other person's position became untenable. Instead, he said, "The man in 3B. What's his name? Why? Because I want to know his name." She looked at him carefully. "Voss, what are you going to do? Have a conversation." "That's not what that sounds like." "His name." "Tatum," she told him. Because she was tired and her side hurt, and he was looking at her with an intensity that made arguing feel like trying to hold water in cupped hands. It ran through no matter how tightly you pressed. He nodded once, the way he nodded when he'd received information he intended to act on. He stood up. He looked around the apartment again, the curtain, the lamp, the folding table, with an expression she still couldn't name. "Lock the door after me," he said. "Voss." He stopped. "Don't do anything that comes back to me," she said. Something in his face shifted. Not quite a smile, not quite anything she had words for. "When have I ever been sloppy?" Then he was gone, and she was alone in her apartment with a bandaged side and a first aid kit on the couch beside her, and the sound of the building settling around her in the dark. She sat there for a long time. She thought about the way he'd crouched in front of her without hesitating, the steadiness of his hands, the fact that he hadn't said a single thing that she'd expected him to say. She had constructed, over 2 years, a very clear picture of Everett Voss, the distances he kept, the way he organized the world into columns of use and not use, the absolute efficiency of every decision he made. She had understood her place in his ledger and been comfortable there, because comfortable was predictable, and predictable was safe, and safe was what she had learned to prioritize above everything else. She had not expected him to look at her apartment like it bothered him. She had not expected him to know what to do with a first aid kit. She had not expected, when he said her name, to feel something shift in the bones of her chest. She locked the door. She lay down on the couch because it was closer than the alcove, and she was still in her work clothes, and she told herself she was just going to rest for a minute. She was asleep before she finished the thought. She woke up to her phone. The light through the window, the one that looked at brick, was the pale grey of early morning. Her side ached with the specific insistence of healing things. She lay still for a moment, cataloguing the previous night the way she catalogued everything. Voss at the door, the suit, his hands steady, the first aid kit. Don't do anything that comes back to me. Her phone said 612. It also said she had a message from a number she didn't recognize. Building management will be contacting you today regarding a unit on the 3rd floor. A vacancy has opened. No fee transfer, no application. Your name is already on the lease if you want it. 3rd floor faces the courtyard. Quieta. She read it twice. She sat up slowly. There was a second message from the same number, sent 4 minutes after the first. The 9 o'clock is rescheduled. Take the morning. She stared at her phone for a long time. Then she did something she almost never did in the mornings, which was to not immediately begin the list of things that needed to be done. She set her phone face down on the couch cushion, and she looked at the ceiling, and she let herself feel, for just a moment, the strange and unfamiliar weight of someone having quietly rearranged the world around her while she was sleeping. Not solved it, not fixed her, not handed her money and made her a problem he'd neutralized. Just moved something in the way so she could see around it. She was still thinking about it when she got to the office at 10:30. Late, which she never was, and found Voss already in his office with the door open, which he did when he was available for interruption, and a coffee on her desk that was still hot. She stood in the doorway of her own office for a moment. He looked up. "The unit," she said. "3rd floor. Courtyard view. I haven't said yes." "No," he agreed. "You haven't." She looked at him across the distance of the 2 offices, and she thought about ledgers, about columns, about the way she'd watched him organize everything into use and not use, cost and benefit, liability and asset. She'd thought she understood exactly where she fell in that accounting. She was beginning to think she'd made an error somewhere in the math. "If I take it," she said, "it's a loan, with interest." Something moved in his expression. "I don't need with interest," she said again, steadily. "Written up properly, documented." He looked at her for a moment that stretched past the point of comfortable. "Fine," he said. "Fine," she said. She sat down at her desk. She picked up her coffee. She pulled up the Thursday schedule for the Hargrove meeting and started moving pieces around to make it work. She didn't look up, but she could feel him watching her from across the open doorway, the way she'd learned to feel things in this job, quietly, in the part of herself that kept track of what was safe and what was not. She was beginning to revise that list. 3 weeks later, she learned that he'd called off the engagement. She found out the way she found out most things about Everett Voss. Sideways. From a document she wasn't meant to see, a letter from Cressida Langhammer's attorneys about the returned ring and the formal dissolution of the arrangement, filed Misfield into a folder she'd been reorganizing. She read the first 2 lines before she closed it and put it back exactly where she'd found it. She did not ask him about it. He did not mention it. She moved into the 3rd floor unit on a Saturday with 2 bags, the same 2 bags she'd arrived in this city with because she had never accumulated very much, and found, on the kitchen counter, a lamp. The tall kind with a warm bulb, bright enough to actually light a room. There was no note. She plugged it in. She stood in her new apartment with a courtyard view and light that actually worked, and a door with a proper lock, and her 2 bags on the floor, and she thought about the first night she'd come to this city. The temp agency contact number. The way she'd learned to make herself small and efficient and invisible, to be useful in ways that nobody noticed until she stopped. She had spent a long time learning to take up as little space as possible. The lamp filled the room. She didn't know what to do with that yet. She had a feeling she was going to have to learn. Monday morning she arrived at the office at her usual time. Voss was already there, which he always was. The door was open, which meant he was available. She set down her bag and started on the morning summary and did not say anything about the lamp. Neither did he. But when she looked up from her desk an hour into the morning, he was watching her through the open doorway with an expression she was beginning, finally, slowly, to recognize. Like a man who had run the numbers 100 times and kept arriving at the same answer, and had only recently stopped arguing with the result. She looked back down at her work. She allowed herself, privately in the part of herself that kept track of things, one small note. Unexpected. Outside, the city went about its business. Inside, a lamp sat on a counter in a third-floor apartment with a courtyard view, and Tatum Reeve had started, for the first time in a long time, to consider the possibility that safe and small were not the same thing after all.